All right, well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to week number 2 for organization theory. Hope everyone's doing well. Your
Morning.
week is off to a good start. Thank you for your responses to Canvas essay number 1. I took a look through all of those, and I think all the organizations or divisions and departments within organizations that everyone mentioned in the post, I think they all will work well for the course assignment. So Dane provided a lot of feedback to you. I basically just said, yes, this organization will work well for the course assignments, just to let you know that you're in good shape and ready to move onward and upward using that organization. So thank you to everyone who posted. If you have not posted responses to your classmates yet, do make sure to get that done by the end of tonight, and I'll get all those responses graded. Then we're moving onward to Canvas essay number 2. And for Canvas essay number 2, we're going to draw on some of the material from last week. And you'll be comparing one public or nonprofit organization to one corollary private organization, two similarities and two differences between those organizations, but with an eye on what those differences mean for how we study those organizations. So as you talk about those differences and those similarities between public versus private organizations, I want you to keep in mind the big so what question. Well, what does that mean? So what? What does it mean for the way in which we study those organizations? And so you can certainly draw on the information that we covered in class last Monday. You can also draw on some of the information we covered in the 500 class and the Graham Allison article, and I think that should probably provide you with ample information to identify two similarities and two differences. Again, just like with week number 1 for Canvas essay number 2, if you can get your initial post done earlier in the week, Thursday or Friday or so, that'll then provide an opportunity for your classmates to then read your post and then be able to respond to it. So if everyone waits for their initial posts until Monday, then obviously it's going to be a little difficult for people to have something to respond to. So in terms of assignments, that's where we are currently. Last week, we talked about some of the basic information in terms of organization theory. We talked about differences between public and private organizations. We talked about what organization theory is. We talked about different ways of studying organization theory, a micro approach versus a macro approach versus a management-oriented type of an approach. We talked about some of the reasons why business theories don't work particularly well in the public sector and how they need to be modified and changed in order to apply to public organizations. We also talked about how one size fits all panaceas also don't work in public organization theory because there are so many nuances and so many differences between public organizations, from their size to their functions to their environment to their employees, that it makes it difficult just to have this one size fits all type of an approach. And that's the theme I want to pick up on tonight as we begin our in-depth exploration of the development of public organization theory. So we know a one-size-fits-all approach does not work, and that really is what underscores the entire evolution of the organization theory literature. So tonight we are going to talk about classic organization theory. And a lot of these classical theorists like the Weber and the Taylors and the Fayles and the Mooneys and the Gulicks, a lot of these individuals were very much looking for that one size fits all type of an approach. But we have learned over the past 150 years that just simply is not possible. We'll spend our first part of class tonight talking about classic organization theorists. And then I have a group exercise for us to work on. And then we'll assess our time. Once we're done with the group exercise, we'll see where we are at. If we have a lot of time left available this evening, then we might start to venture into neoclassical theories and start talking a bit about pre-human relations theory. If we don't have enough time, then we'll just reserve that topic then for next week. But the primary topic tonight, classic organization theory. Okay, let's go ahead and jump into our material. And again, these authors are somewhat familiar to you. We covered them in the 500 course, and you've also may have covered them in some of your other courses so far in the DL MPA program. But where we always start our discussion of classic organization theory, we always start with our good friend Max Weber. And we know that Max Weber approaches the study of public organizations from outside of the field of public administration. And so when you're looking at when Max Weber was writing in the late 1800s, the whole idea of the study of a field of public administration was really in its infancy. I mean, we didn't really see that begin until Woodrow Wilson and his study of administration in 1887. And the study of public administration really did not take shape, if you will, until the early 1900s. And so Weber was not writing about public organizations. He was not a public administration theorist. A lot of his work was done in different fields, such as sociology, but he really did believe that if we could find the perfect way to structure an organization, that perfect structure, that ideal structure, could then create effective and efficient organizations. So the ultimate goal of Max Weber, as we know, was to try and make our organizations as efficient and effective as possible. And the primary way that we could do that was through structuring our organizations in this one ideal type, in this one size fits all type of an approach. Max Weber really believed in bureaucratic organizations as being what he considered the highest level of rationalization. Weber really believed in basing our decisions not on belief, but rather basing our decisions on empiricism, the development of empirical evidence. And in the 500 course, you talked about the idea of empiricism and empirical evidence. We know that empiricism, for something to be empirical in nature, it must be tangible, it must be measurable, it must be something we can actually kind of sense and feel. So we're going to collect this tangible information, and that tangible information, that empirical information, as we know, can be both qualitative as well as quantitative. It can be information that's communicated by phrases and words like qualitative. It can be information that is communicated through numbers, such as in quantitative methodology. So they can be both qualitative as well as quantitative. But to be empirical, it must be tangible, must be something that can be experienced. So they believed we should make our decisions by collecting this tangible empirical information and then analyzing this information to then draw our conclusions. And that's kind of the whole thrust, if you will, of what we consider to be rational decision-making theory. So he was very much of a rational decision-making theorist. So we collect this empirical information, we document it, we measure it, and we use that to then make our decisions. Weber also believed that there were different sources of authority that organizational leaders can rely upon. There are three basic types of authority in Weber's writing. There's charismatic authority, there's what he calls traditional authority, and then there's what he calls legal rational basis for authority. So each one of these three different types of authority structures will then spawn an administrative system. So the charismatic authority will then spawn an administrative system known as charismatic administration. And we're all familiar with charismatic leadership. You've probably talked about it in some of your other courses in the MPA program. You've probably also lived it. You may have had some leaders in your organization who were charismatic leaders. Charismatic leaders lead by the character of their personality. And so, with a charismatic leader, the authority is vested within the person as opposed to being invested in the position or the organization. So, the authority is within that person themselves. There are two different theories of charismatic leadership. There's what's called attribution theory, and then there's what's called self-concept theory. So attribution theory, I'll put it in text chat because it's not on the slide, but attribution theory and self-concept theory. In attribution theory, people follow a leader because they feel that leader is demonstrating the types of characteristics and the types of actions that they ascribe to good leadership. So they will follow someone whose behavior and characteristics they attribute to being a good leader. So things such as a leader who makes decisions that are highly discrepant of the status quo. So leaders who are willing to make decisions that run counter to the status quo, that run counter to the way in which the organization has always done it. That is a characteristic that people attribute to good leadership. So if they see a leader doing that, they will follow that leader because that leader is exemplifying what they consider to be good leadership strategies and characteristics. Then the second theory of charismatic leadership is what's called the self-concept theory. People will follow leaders who they identify with. So if they kind of see themselves in this leader, then they will follow that leader because again, they find themselves very closely aligned with that person and they can see themselves in that leader. That's the self-concept theory of charismatic leadership. But whether people follow a charismatic leader because of attribution theory or self-concept theory, when people follow a charismatic leader, again, the authority resides within that charismatic leader. So the administrative system that emerges from charismatic authority tends to be an inherently unstable administrative system. Organizations and positions are much more permanent and much more stable than the people who occupy those positions. So these charismatic leaders can always leave the organization, and they could leave the organization very, very quickly. And when that charismatic leader leaves the organization, they then take their authority with them because the authority is located within the person as opposed to the position. So charismatic administration tends to be very inherently unstable. That's the downside of charismatic administrative systems. The upside of charismatic administrative systems is that charismatic leaders tend to engender a lot of loyalty on the part of their followers. So people tend to be much more loyal to charismatic leaders than they will be loyal to positions or to organizations. So it engenders strong following, if you will, engenders strong loyalty to that leader, but it tends to be unstable because leaders do leave their positions. Obviously, these charismatic administrative systems that come out of charismatic authority are not the ideal for Max Weber. Because again, he wants something that is much more aligned with rational types of thinking. So we said then the second type of authority is what's referred to as traditional authority. In traditional authority, authority is exercised today because it's been exercised that way in the past. So you think about royal families and divine right of kings and things such as that. Those types of authorities, the basis of authority, those types of administrative systems, they engender people to follow them because it's always been done like that in the past. There are three different administrative systems that can tend to come out of a traditional basis of authority: patriarchal administrative systems, patrimonial administrative systems, and feudal administrative systems. So patriarchal, patrimonial, and feudal administrative systems all grow out of this traditional authority type of basis. In a patriarchal type of administrative system, the leadership and the governance is typically done very much internally. So you'll have one leader. That leader will be the repository of the vast majority of authority and power in this relationship. They may lead in conjunction, perhaps, with some very close family members, maybe their children, their spouse, but the authority really resides within that nuclear type of family, a very patriarchal type of administrative structure. based on internal governance. In a patrimonial administrative structure, what happens is you start to see the power and the governance start to become a little bit more decentralized. So instead of only being involved in that nuclear family, you then start to see more distant relatives being involved. And so aunts and uncles and cousins start to be delegated some power and some authority. So it starts to become a little bit more decentralized in a patrimonial administrative structure as opposed to a patriarchal structure. Then in the feudal administrative structure, this is where we see a great deal of decentralization. We see governance and leadership being exercised externally by political allies. And so this is like in a feudal society, you would have the royal family that would get people to follow the royal family by giving them incentives such as land. And so I'll provide you with this land. I will make you a nobleman. I will make you a baron or whatever the case may be. And then by providing you those titles and providing you with that land, you will then essentially govern this territory the way in which I want you to govern this territory. So it's kind of more of a transactional type of a relationship. But patriarchal, patrimonial, and feudal are all growing out of this traditional authority type of basis. What Weber really believed in is he believed in the legal, rational basis for authority. And the legal, rational basis for authority will then create a bureaucratic administrative system. And in the bureaucratic administrative system, this is when administration is being done by a technical administrator, by a bureaucrat, someone who has the knowledge, skills, and abilities to do the job and make these decisions on a daily basis. Now, again, remember, Weber believed that a bureaucracy was the utmost level, the highest level of rationality. And so he really believed in these bureaucratic administrative structures that would grow out of this legal, rational authority system. So the authority comes from laws. The authority comes from these rules and these laws that are established by these bureaucrats in these bureaucratic organizations. So it really does give rise to this whole idea of the bureaucracy in the bureaucratic system. So in Weber's bureaucratic system, his focus was primarily on the structure of the bureaucracy. Weber believed that if we could structure our organizations in the ideal manner, with the ideal characteristics, that those ideal bureaucratic organizations would then be capable of being efficient as well as effective. So, as we had talked about in 500, and you're familiar with, the Weberian ideal bureaucracy highlights certain characteristics in a bureaucratic organization. So, to be an ideal bureaucratic organization, that organization would need to exhibit things such as a division of labor, specialization of tasks, a span of control, a unity of command, a tall hierarchical structure, an organization that's based upon rules and regulations, an organization that is staffed by professional career administrators, and an organization that bases its decisions on written documentation, that everything gets documented within that organization. So let's go through each of those quickly and talk about the advantages and disadvantages of each one of these characteristics of a Weberian ideal bureaucracy. Because even though we are all working in what we consider to be modern bureaucracies today, our modern bureaucratic organizations probably exhibit a lot of these elements of the classical Weberian ideal bureaucratic organization. So, division of labor. We all have division of labor in our organizations. We divide up the work so that different people are doing different jobs. We do that in almost all of our bureaucratic organizations. We do that in our legislative organizations as well. We do that in Congress. As Woodrow Wilson told us, Congress at work is Congress in committees. So in Congress, the division of labor revolves around the use of these committees and these subcommittees. In our bureaucratic organizations, division of labor revolves around departments, divisions, and units within our organizations. So division of labor is good for dividing up the work to make the completion of that work a little bit more feasible, a little bit more efficient. One of the downsides of division of labor is siloing. And we know that some of our organizations become very much siloed. And so one part of the organization does not know or does not really care about what another part of the organization is doing. So when you end up getting siloed as organizations, there's not a whole lot of communication and exchange of information between those silos. And that's a downside of division of labor. When you divide up this labor, then we have people who are specializing in tasks. The advantage of task specialization is that people, because they're doing these jobs on a daily basis, will obviously become experts in these jobs, and they will become very good at doing these jobs. And so they'll be better at doing these jobs than someone who's not doing this job on a daily basis. The disadvantage of specialization of tasks is, again, this whole idea of siloing. And so if you don't have cross-functional training, then people will only focus on the set of tasks that they have on a daily basis, and they'll be completely unaware of the tasks of other people in the organization. They might be unaware of how the tasks that they are doing relate to the tasks that are being done by their colleagues in other units and divisions and departments in the organization. Span of control means that we are limiting the number of people that a manager is responsible for. So rather than a manager being responsible for every single person under them in the organization chart, we will limit their span of control to perhaps 3 or 5 or 7 subordinates. By limiting their span of control, we make it a little bit more practical that they will be able to have the information that they need in order to control and monitor the actions of those 3, 5, or 7 people. This kind of gets back to that idea we talked about last week, principal-agent relationship. And so if you're the manager, you're the principal, and the people who are working for you are the agents, they're going to have the most of the information. And if you have to oversee a large number of people, you're not going to have the requisite information to be able to effectively do that. So we limit the span of control of our managers in an ideal bureaucracy. And we also have a unity of command so that everyone in the organization knows to whom they are responsible. The downside, obviously, of a unity of command is that sometimes it becomes a little bit too strict. And sometimes, if you can only respond to and you can only communicate with your direct supervisor, perhaps your direct supervisor is not the most likely or the most appropriate person for you to be communicating with. But if we adhere strictly to this unity of command, then you just kind of have this straight line of authority straight up your organizational chart. Tall hierarchy, this pyramidal shape that we're all very familiar with in public administration, was another element of the ideal bureaucracy. One person at top, and then as you move down the organization structure, you encounter more and more employees. Nice thing about tall hierarchy is, again, it adds some rhyme and reason to how the organization operates. Everyone knows where they fit in that hierarchical organizational chart. The downside, there are many, but one of the downsides to a tall hierarchy is sometimes you are divorcing decision making from where the information resides in order to make those decisions. And so if you're saying decisions are only being made at the top level of this tall hierarchy, well, maybe the information we need to make those decisions, that information occupies the lower levels of our organizational chart. So sometimes if we can flatten that hierarchy a bit, we can better align the source of information with decision-making responsibility. Obviously, rule bound, Faber tells us everything is documented in our organization, so we are bound by these written rules and procedures. The good thing about being rule bound and having this written type of documentation is that you can treat people equally. So here are the rules get applied to everyone equally. There will not be arbitrary, capricious, or prejudicial decisions made with individuals we come into contact with. Everyone is dealt with equally in accordance with the rules and the regulations. The downside of rules and regulations is, and we mentioned this last week, that as organizations get older, they tend to get larger. They also tend to get more disaggregated. They tend to develop more rules and regulations. And so as they get older and develop these rules and regulations become more fragmented, the problem is that sometimes the goal of the organization becomes adhering to these rules and regulations as opposed to serving the desires and the needs of the consumers and the citizens who come into contact with that organization. That's what Robert Merton refers to as goal displacement. We have now displaced the true goal of serving our citizens with the false goal of trying to just adhere to rules and regulations. So, in adherence to rules and regulations, displace our true goal of serving our citizens. That's what Merton refers to as one of the primary bureaucratic dysfunctions that we tend to see in older, larger bureaucratic organizations. And that since these people are specializing in certain tasks on a daily basis, these individuals then become very much experts. They are professionals. They have the knowledge, skills, and abilities that they need in order to do these tasks effectively and efficiently. And the assumption is that these individuals also view their presence in this organization as a career. They are not free agents who bounce between organizations. They view it as they are in this organization for their entire career. Hence the reason why they are not political appointees, why they are not appointed based upon partisanship, but rather they are being appointed based upon their technical expertise, their knowledge, their skills, and their abilities. So we already mentioned written documentation, but these are all the basic characteristics, the basic elements of a Weberian ideal bureaucracy. So Weber makes the argument if we can structure our organizations in this ideal bureaucratic structure, the purpose then is it will then make our organizations efficient as well as effective. So when we look at Max Weber and his idea of organizational structure and this idea of a ideal type of bureaucratic structure, and we compare it then back to the models of organizational effectiveness, as we're going to do with each one of our theories and each one of our theorists. And you can do this if you happen to have the Tompkins text. Tompkins does this on page 59 of the newest version of the Tompkins text, where he could, through this competing values framework, this Quinn Rohrbach framework, he says you've got, again, these four different models of how you measure the effectiveness of an organization: the rational goal model, the open systems model, the human relations model, and the internal process model. For Max Weber and ideal bureaucratic theory, obviously the two models of organizational effectiveness that are highlighted: rational goal model and internal process model. So in the rational goal model, we are emphasizing productivity, we are emphasizing efficiency, we are doing it through setting macro level goals, goals for the organization, and then focusing the efforts of the organization on achieving those goals. And we're doing it primarily through this structural type of a focus. Since we are focusing on the structure of the organization, the second model of organizational effectiveness that's highlighted by Weber is the internal process model of effectiveness. In the internal process model, we are emphasizing stability and control of the internal workings of the organization through the management of information, the management of communications, and very much of a top-down coordinative type of control, a feature to leadership and management. So we need to coordinate, control the work activities that are going on within the organization. So Weber would define effectiveness through both internal process as well as goal achievement, this rational goal model. There's not a whole lot of open systems because he is looking at the structure within the organization, not necessarily anything with the environment that surrounds the organization, not a human relations focus because he's not really concerned about human resource development. He's concerned about achieving the macro level goals of the organization. irrespective of what that may mean for the goals of individual employees. So I think it's a pretty easy one when we look at Weber and organizational effectiveness. It's internal process and rational goal models. And those are pretty clear and pretty straightforward. Then, as we're going to do with all of our theorists, we're then going to look at Mintzberg's mechanisms for coordination and control of work activities. For Weber, the emphasis is obviously on direct supervision. You've got this tall hierarchy, you've got this unity of command, you've got this span of control. You're going to have a lot of centralization. You're going to have a lot of top-down direction and micromanagement. So the emphasis is obviously on direct supervision of employees. There's also, according to Tompkins, an emphasis on the standardization of work processes as well as the standardization of worker skills. There's not a whole lot of concern in terms of standardization of the work outputs. That's going to be something that we're going to see many decades later in the quality management movement. So not a whole lot of emphasis on that, and not a whole lot of emphasis on standardization of values. It really didn't matter that much to Weber if individual values were congruent with organizational values, because organization values and goals will always trump individual goals and values. So it's all about the macro level organization. So there's not a whole lot of concern about trying to standardize values between the organization and the individual. Then in terms of our motivational strategies, without question, it's legal compliance. Abiding by these rules, using these rules, these formal directives, these sanctions to get people to behave in the way in which they need to behave within their roles in order to make the organization as efficient and effective as possible. So it is very much of a top-down type of approach, and that's one of the primary problems that's associated with Weber and his classic organization theory, is that when you're only focusing on the macro level, you're only focusing on the organization, obviously you're not paying a whole lot of attention to individual employees. The benefit of an individual employee is what that employee can contribute to the achievement of goals on the part of the organization itself. So it tends to be a relatively dehumanizing approach to how we treat individual employees. And that dehumanizing approach was one of the primary criticisms that eventually led to the creation of some of our neoclassical theories that we will get into in our discussion next week. But in classic organization theory, that's where we always start. We always start with Max Weber, again, a theorist outside of the normal field of public administration. Then another theorist that you're familiar with and you were introduced to in the 500 course, Frederick Taylor, also comes to us from outside of the world of public administration. Frederick Taylor wrote most of his theories were designed for private business organizations. So what happened is we took some of these Taylor-esque theories, if you will, that were designed for the private sector, and we then took them and applied them to public sector organizations, oftentimes with not a lot of success, because we realized we had to modify them to make them meet the requirements of a public organization. Let's talk a bit more about Frederick Taylor and get into a little bit more detail with Frederick Taylor than we had a chance to get into when we covered him in 500. So you're familiar with Frederick Taylor, and you know the primary theory that comes out of Taylor's work is scientific management. Taylor felt that there was a need for the creation of a science of management. When Taylor was writing, he was writing in the early 1900s, the 1910s, the 1920s. He was writing in a period of time where we had a lot of unrest, a lot of labor unrest in our organizations. He was writing at a time where works such as The Jungle by Upton Sinclair were gaining in popularity. And he realized that most of our organizations were not very stable places to work. So we had a lot of this labor unrest that he wanted to try and quell. We had very little supervision and guidance that was being given by upper level management to employees. Employees were kind of doing what they wanted to do without a whole lot of top-down direct supervision. And the reason for that is that there was this void of middle managers. You essentially had your upper level leadership and management, and then you had your line employees, and nothing really in between. So we kind of lack this whole world of middle managers that we are very familiar with in our organizations today. So what Taylor wanted to do is to come up with a scientific approach to try and address those three problems of no middle managers, little supervision and guidance, and all of this rampant labor unrest. So he develops this idea of scientific management. The purpose of scientific management was to try and eliminate a practice that he referred to as soldiering. Soldiering was the process by which individual employees would do just enough to get by on a daily basis. So they weren't working to try and achieve any level of productivity. They weren't working to try and get better at their jobs. They were just doing as little as they possibly could do to avoid getting in trouble with their managers. And that's what he referred to as soldiering. He wanted to eliminate soldiering through scientific management by creating standards for performance that you could then hold these employees accountable to achieving these standards of performance. Not only did he want to establish these standards of performance for jobs that were being done, but he also wanted to establish standards that we could use in the hiring of employees. So he wanted to establish accepted standards for selecting the quote unquote right employee for a job. And the right employee was the employee that had the requisite knowledge, skills, and abilities in order to do the job productively and to achieve those already established performance standards. So part of scientific management was figuring out how to identify people who had the right skills for the jobs. He also then felt that if we could systematize the production process, and if we could come up with what he referred to as the one best way to do a job, where we could look at the job, we could identify the process of completing this job, we could then find all the efficient movements, all the efficient ways of doing the job, combine those together into this process, and then provide our employees with the tools in order to do this same process day in and day out in this one best way to do the job. That is then what's going to make our organizations efficient and effective. So the difference between Weber and Taylor, Weber focused on structure, Taylor focused on work processes. What unifies Weber and Taylor is they were both looking at it from a macro level organizational perspective, trying to figure out a way to make the organization itself more effective, more efficient, and to help the organization achieve organizational goals. So they both focused on the macro level, just how they did it was a little bit different. Structure for Weber, process for Frederick Taylor in scientific management. Incorporated within scientific management is you not only establish these performance expectations and you hold employees accountable for achieving those expectations, but you also incentivize them to achieve those performance levels through rewards, through remuneration. So you reward them for their performance, and that's a contribution that will then induce them to work harder. So that's this idea of scientific management, all predicated upon what's known as time motion studies. And we had mentioned this in the 500 class, but with a time motion study, it was essentially an efficiency study where you would have an efficiency expert standing there and timing every single movement that an employee took while they were completing a job. So as we had mentioned before, the very simple example of that was shoveling pig ore. So you would measure every single movement that person took when they were shoveling the pig ore, the amount of time it took them to pick up the shovel, the amount of time it took them to put the shovel in the pig ore, the amount of time it took them to lift the shovel up, the amount of time it took them to take the shovel full of pig ore over to the cart and put into the cart, the amount of time it would take them to return to the pile of pig ore and start the process over again. So we would time every single motion taken by that employee for the purpose of getting rid of what we call the false movements. So any motion, any action taken by the employer that was not productive, that would then be eliminated. and then combine all of the efficient movements all together into this thing he called the one best way to do the job. So if we could systematize work processes, systematize how we are hiring people and the skills people need to be hired to do these jobs, then we can make the organization more efficient and more effective. Clearly, there were problems with scientific management. The one primary problem is obviously it was dehumanizing. In his writings, Frederick Taylor referred to people as being boorish beasts. He referred to them as cogs in the machinery. So if a cog breaks, you take it out, throw it away, replace it with another cog. They didn't really have inherent value. The only value that they had was the value that they could contribute to the productivity and the efficiency of the organization itself. So it was a very dehumanizing approach to how we run our organizations. And it was that dehumanizing approach that was the primary criticism that then served as a launching point for neoclassical theories such as human relations and human resource management. So where does scientific management, Frederick Taylor, fit in terms of our models of organizational effectiveness, our mechanisms for control and coordination, as well as our motivational strategies? Well, it's going to look a lot like Weber in terms of models of organizational effectiveness. Just like Weber, Taylor emphasizes the rational goal model as well as the internal process model. So he's going to focus on achieving the goals of the organization, efficiency and effectiveness, and also doing it by looking at the processes that go on within the organization, hence the internal process model. So he'll look a lot like Max Weber. Where he, and again, if you're looking for that in the Tompkins textbook, that is on page 88. Then on page 89, we get to look at the mechanisms for coordination and control with scientific management. Here, it's all about standardization. So standardization of work processes, that is probably the number one mechanism used by Frederick Taylor for controlling work activities. Obviously, we're standardizing the process into the one best way to do the job. And we're also standardizing the outputs because if we have this process, this quality process that's been established, the quality process will then result in a quality output, a quality product that's being produced out of that quality process. Where I part company with Tompkins a little bit is Tompkins does not highlight standardization of worker skills. I think we should, because clearly one of the elements that was very important to scientific management was identifying the skills needed to be successful at doing this job in the one best way, and then hiring people based upon the possession of those skills. So clearly we are coming up with standards, expectations for the skills that our workers need. And so I would say standardization of worker skills is certainly an important mechanism for controlling, coordinating work activities. So I would shade that area in as well if it was me. Not a whole lot in terms of standardization of worker values because, again, didn't really care much about worker values, cared about the organization values instead. Direct supervision is one that Tompkins does not highlight here. I think I would highlight it, probably not to the extent of standardization, but direct supervision is still important here because you are discovering the one best way to do the job. You are then teaching your employees that one best way to do the job, and you are then monitoring them and holding them accountable for doing that job in the one best way. If that's not an element of direct supervision, I really don't know what is. So I would also highlight direct supervision as one of those additional mechanisms for coordination and control. When we get to motivational strategies that underlie scientific management, we definitely have the legal compliance, just like we had with Max Weber. You are establishing these processes. You are then holding people accountable for these processes. If they are not doing the work process in the way in which they're supposed to do it, they're a cog in the machinery. So we can just take them, fire them, get them out of the organization, replace them with someone who will do the job in that one best way. But where Taylor in scientific management adds on to where Weber was at is that it adds on rewards for performance. So here are some instrumental rewards. We are going to give people additional pay for their performance, for adhering to this one best way to do the job. So that type of remuneration is a reward for performance. It is an instrumental, what we call an extrinsic type of reward that will serve as an incentive to keep people doing their jobs productively and in that one best way to do the job. So as you can see, there's a whole lot of overlap between scientific management with Frederick Taylor and Weber's ideal bureaucratic structure. But with Frederick Taylor, we've got a little bit more in terms of rewarding people for their performance. We have more in terms of standardization of processes and standardization of worker skills than what we may have seen over with Max Weber. Now, despite all of the criticisms and the flaws associated with scientific management that gave rise to these newer schools of thought and these newer theories, when you look at scientific management, you see a lot of the artifacts of scientific management alive and well in our modern organizations. You have a position description. You have a position classification system. All of those things come directly out of scientific management, and they are evident in our modern day organizations. So if it wasn't for Frederick Taylor and scientific management, we probably wouldn't have our classification systems, and we probably would not have things like position descriptions. We probably would not have things such as a job analysis. And in human resource management, you learned about these different functions of human resource management. And one of those functions is doing job analysis and job evaluation. A job analysis where we analyze the components of each individual job, that we take the results of that job analysis to use to compare one job to another for the purpose of placing them on our position classification system and then assigning compensation. So a lot of those very fundamental functions of human resource management come out of Frederick Taylor and his scientific management approach. But again, here's another example of a theorist who has made major contributions to our understanding of public organizations, who approached it from a private sector type of perspective. So he approached it outside of the field of public administration. We took scientific management, we modified it, and we then applied it in our public organizations. Scientific management really took off like wildfire in the 1920s, not just in the private sector, but also started being adopted at the federal level in federal agencies as well. And again, we still see a lot of vestiges of it today in our modern day organizations. So Taylor's scientific management is another what we consider to be classical type of theory. Another author who I consider to be a classical author, I think Tompkins deals with this person under the rubric of what he calls administrative management school. I kind of put this person in the classical school because there are some definite similarities between this person and Max Weber and Frederick Taylor, and that person is Henri Fayolle. Henri Fayolle recommends to us that in order to make our organizations effective and efficient, we need to look at our organizations from kind of a broader type of perspective. So rather than looking at how do we structure our organization or how we organize the work process, like with Frederick Taylor, he says, let's think about managing our organizations within the umbrella of governing the organization. So rather than just looking at managing the organization, let's look at how we govern the organization. So he argues when we are governing organizations, we engage in a lot of different activities, management being only one of these many activities that all underpin the overall governance of the organization. He says when we govern organizations, we are not only managing those organizations, allocating resources and managing personnel, but we are also engaging in what he calls technical activities and commercial activities and financial activities and security activities and accounting activities. In other words, when we are managing our organizations, we are really governing them. As we govern them, these are all the things that we are doing in the governance of our organization beyond just managing people and managing operations. We are also managing technologies that in creating our goods and services, in creating our products, we are using technology in the creation of those products. And so therefore we have to manage that technology. So if you think about, just like in MPA education, now we have to know how to manage artificial intelligence, generative AI. That's a technology that we are going to have to manage in the future in MPA programs. So we need to know how to manage technology. We need to know which technology to use and then be conversant in those appropriate forms of technology. So we engage in those technical types of activities. As managers, we also engage in commercial activities. Commercial activities will be these transactions between the organization and its external environment. So transactions between the organization and contractors, for example. So if you want to construct a building, you're going to put it out for bid with an RFP, and then you're going to have a private sector contractor that will bid on that RFP. That's a commercial type of activity. You are paying that contractor to then construct this building for you. Sometimes you will hire experts, you'll hire consultants. Those are all commercial types of activities. So any types of transactions your organization's having with stakeholders in the external environment, those are commercial activities that also have to be managed within the governance of the organization. There are financial activities. You have to acquire resources from your external environment through appropriations or through grant funding or however you're getting those resources. How you generate those resources and from whom, those will fall within this category of financial activities that also have to be managed in the governance of the organization. Security activities, securing your employees, securing your intellectual property. Those are security activities that we also engage in. And then since we are a public sector organization and we are dealing with public taxpayer money, we have accounting activities that also fall within the governance of our organization. So we have to account for how funds are being spent. We have to segregate our money into different funds, general funds, special revenue funds, proprietary funds, fiduciary funds, and make sure that we manage that money in those different funds in accordance with public interest. We are going to be required to conduct internal and external audits, depending upon the organization we're in, depending upon the programs that we are implementing. All those auditing requirements also have to be managed within these accounting types of activities. What I like about FAIL's theory is that FAIL recommends to us to think a little bit bigger about how we need to manage our organizations, rather than just structure, rather than just work process. Think about it in the perspective of how we govern the organization and all the things that we do on a daily basis in governing our organizations. Fail says when we are governing our organizations, he established 5 essential functions of managing and governing our organizations: planning, organizing, commanding, coordinating, and controlling. So we all engage in planning the operations of our organization, short and long term, engaging in a strategic planning process. That is an essential function of management. Organizing. We have got all these different people and all these different units within our organization. We need to try and organize it effectively to make sure that we have the right people and the right units doing the right type of work to accomplish our goals. So organization is an essential function of management as well. Commanding, kind of this top-down, telling our employees and telling all the parts of our organization, this is what needs to be done, this is how it needs to be done. Commanding is an essential function. Coordinating is obviously an essential function. If you've got these siloed parts of your organization, you have the left hand doing something the right hand doesn't know what it's doing. And so therefore you need to have this coordination, another essential function of management. And controlling the overall operations of the organization, the fifth essential function of management. So Fayol argues to us that if we can focus on these five essential administrative management functions, this is how we can make our organizations more effective and more efficient. Based upon those five essential functions, Fayol then develops his approach to what's known as the principal school of management. He identifies here are discrete principles that if we adhere to these principles, we can make our organizations effective and efficient. Some of them are very familiar to what we talked about with Max Weber. So things such as division of labor, division of work. A second principle is authority creates responsibility, meaning that if you provide someone with authority over a task or a function, that authority will then make them responsible, and it will then enhance their responsibility levels. So it really has that kind of benefit of making people more accountable and more responsible for their behaviors. Third principle of management is discipline. You need to have some authority basis whereby you can discipline people for not doing the jobs in the way in which they're supposed to do it, or for behaving in ways that are outside of the expected norms of the organization. Unity of command, just like with Max Weber, you have to have this chain of command, this scalar chain, this unity of command. You have to have subordination to the general interests. And so this kind of gets into those ASPA code of ethics principles that we talked about way back in 500. The principle of putting public interest above private interest. That's what he's talking about here with the subordination of private interest to the general or the public interest. Remuneration. So this is part of Frederick Taylor as well. Remunerating, compensating people for doing the jobs in the way in which they're supposed to do it. Centralization. So you have this top-down chain of command with this centralization, this kind of directing type of an approach. Order, that this chain of command, this division of work, this unity of command will provide you with order within the organization. So people know what to expect on a daily basis with what they are doing and with what others are doing within the organization. Equity. Equity is very important in organizations, and there's a theory known as the Adams equity theory. And Adams equity theory says that if people don't feel that they're being treated equitably, that they don't feel there is a balance between the contributions they are giving to the organization and the benefits they are getting from those contributions, then they're going to be disinclined to work harder. It's going to serve as a disincentive for those people to be productive. So you really need to balance inputs and outputs, the contributions with the rewards that people are getting, and people need to feel that they're being treated equitably by the organization. If they feel they're putting in too many contributions and the contributions are outweighing the rewards, obviously they will not work quite as hard. Stability of personnel. This goes back to Max Weber and his idea of career administrators. You want stable personnel. Stable personnel gives you institutional memory. It also reduces the amount of costs that you are spending by recruiting and onboarding new employees. Turnover is a major problem in many organizations in the public sector. One example here at Long Beach is in the Dean's Office in Health and Human Services. Right now, about 60% of positions are now vacant because you have a lot of turnover, a lot of people leaving to go to other CSUs or going to UCs or going to the private sector. That costs you a lot of money. Not only does it overburden your current employees to pick up the slack that used to be done by those former employees, but again, you've got a lot of recruitment and a lot of onboarding types of expenses. Initiative. People need to feel emboldened and empowered to take initiative. Now, they're taking initiative not to fulfill their own wants, needs, and desires, but taking initiative to try and meet the goals and objectives of the organization. And the final principle of management, according to Fayol, is the creation of this esprit de corps. This esprit de corps basically means the feeling that we're all in this together. That's a feeling of teamwork within the organization. So he says these are the principles that will make an organization effective. These are the principles that we need to focus on as we manage and govern our organizations to make those organizations effective. So, how do we implement all these principles in our organizations? According to FAIL, we go through a process, a survey, plan, report, document process. Meaning that first off, we have to survey our organization. We have to be very clear and honest with ourselves about how well we're achieving our goals, how well people are doing their jobs and achieving those performance standards that are set for them. We have to survey our organization and kind of do a needs analysis of our organization. Through this survey, this needs analysis, we can then identify the needs that we have to focus upon in order to make our organizations more effective. We will then put together a plan, focus on those needs, and then implement that plan. When we implement that plan, we then have to report on our successes and failures, again, in a very honest way, and then produce those reports in written, documented form. Having an organization chart will help us document the responsibilities and activities of everyone within the organization so that we can see how well we are embedding those different principles into our organization. But FAO is known as kind of the starter, if you will, of this principles approach to organization theory, where he identifies discrete principles and says, if we can adhere to these principles, this is what's going to make our organization effective and efficient. James Mooney picked up on Henri Fayol's principle school and built upon it with his own approach to the necessary principles to make organizations effective and efficient. He basically took all these different principles of Fayol and he kind of distilled them into a small number of principles. Fayol, with his esprit de corps and initiative and authority resulting in responsibility, kind of looked at a lot of psychological factors and kind of looked at the psychological factors of employees to see how we could manipulate those psychological factors to make our organizations more effective. Mooney, through his principles approach, looked a little bit more at organization structure as opposed to Fayol's psychological approach. And according to Mooney, there are three primary principles of organizations that we need to adhere to in order to make our organizations effective. What he calls the coordinative principle, the scalar chain principle, and then the third principle that he's best known for, the functional principle. The coordinative principle is just like with Fayol, you need to coordinate the actions of your organization, the behaviors of people and units within your organization. The scalar chain principle is very similar to Max Weber. You have the scalar chain, this organizational chart. Everyone knows to whom they are responsible. But the real innovative one here with Mooney is his functional principle. In the functional principle, Mooney then differentiates between different types of employees. And so for the first time in the literature, we are now seeing a theorist who is differentiating between our employees. For Weber and for Taylor and for Fayol, an employee was an employee. You know, they're cogs in the machinery. They're just parts of the machinery. They're kind of all replaceable. Here, Mooney says that's not really true. There are different types of employees. And he comes up with this binary distinction of line versus staff employees. Line employees are employees who are actually delivering the goods and services being produced by the organization on a daily basis. So these line employees are the ones who are interfacing with citizens to deliver these products and these goods and these services. These line employees are essentially what you refer to, or Mike Lipsky referred to as your street level bureaucrats. These are your street level bureaucrats who are coming into daily one-on-one contact with members of the public. Then your second type of employee is a staff employee. A staff employee is someone who does not interact with the public on a daily basis, but rather they're the ones responsible for providing the resources to make the work of the line employees possible. So the office space that they'll be using and the money that they'll be spending and the approval of the purchase orders, all of that gets done by staff. And then those processes will then make the work of the line employees possible. So this is an important, again, innovation here, if you will, in terms of organization theory. Well, we're saying not every employee is the same. Some are line employees, some are staff employees. Well, so what? What's the big so what here? The big so what is you need to deal with those employees differently depending upon their different functions. So line employees may need certain types of supports and certain types of things to be effective in their jobs that are much different than the types of supports that a staff employee may need. And so by knowing the differences in the functions of these different employees, you can then better support those employees appropriately to then help them make the organization more effective and more efficient. So it's really that functional principle from Mooney that he is best remembered for. And I think we still make this distinction in a lot of our organizations today between line and staff employees. The real heavyweight in the principles approach to managing organizations is our good friend Luther Gulick. In the 500 class, we talked about Luther Gulick as being one of our first organization theorists who really approached it from a public administration perspective. So Weber was by training a sociologist. Taylor was by training a business professor and did a lot of work with private organizations. Fail came at it from more of a psychological perspective. Mooney came at it from more of a business organization perspective. But here with Luther Gulick, we have someone who is coming at it from a public administration perspective. And if you remember when we talked about Luther Gulick previously, we said Luther Gulick is best known for his principal school of management, but also very well known for his service on the Brownlow Commission. And that in the 1930s, with the FDR administration and FDR's response to the Great Depression, we had FDR creating all these different programs and all these different federal agencies for the purpose of helping state and local governments pull themselves out of the throes of the Great Depression. By creating all these federal programs and all these federal agencies and departments, FDR was losing control of the federal bureaucracy. The federal bureaucracy was growing exponentially. And it made it very difficult for one person, President Roosevelt, to try and manage the entire federal bureaucracy. So the Brownlow Commission was organized to try and reorganize the executive branch to make it easier for the president to control. And so as a result of the Brownlow Commission, that's where we end up getting things such as the Executive Office of the President, this umbrella agency where all these management-based agencies were then placed within to help the president then have an arm of management over this ever-increasing federal bureaucracy. And Luther Gulick served on the Brownlow Commission, and really the Brownlow Commission gave him the opportunity to take a lot of the theories that he had designed and then apply those theories directly to the reorganization of the federal executive branch. So he had some real practical import and practical impact upon federal public administration. So Gulick, like Fail and Mooney, believed that if we could establish and then teach principles of management, that these principles of management could help our managers become more effective in achieving the goals of the organization. The similarity between this principles approach and Weber and Taylor is that we are again looking at the overall success of the organization. So we're taking very much of this macro level approach, looking at what is in the best interest of the organization, how can we help the organization best meet its organizational goals, kind of irrespective of individual goals. So we're still not really taking individual employees into account. As you know, Luther Gulick in his principles approach goes by the acronym POSCORB, which stands for Planning, Organizing, Staffing, Directing, Coordinating, Reporting, and Budgeting. And we know what all those things are. We've kind of already talked about most of those when we talked about Fail and Mooney. But this is what Graham Allison back in our 500 class talked about in terms of the similar functions between public and private administration. that all public and private managers, regardless of what sector they are working in, they all engage in strategic planning. They all engage in organizing the operations of their organization. They all engage in directing employees on how to do their jobs effectively and efficiently. They all engage in coordinating the functions of all the different internal processes going on within our organizations. They all engage in reporting and they all engage in budgeting, acquiring resources, and then spending those resources to achieve their organizational goals. So everybody does this, but as Allison told us, the difference is in how they do it. And how it's done in the public sector is different than how it's done in the private sector. But Gulick's argument is if we can teach our managers these different principles, the principles basically become tools in the managerial toolkit. So Gulick believes the best way to make our organizations effective is to teach our managers these different tools, these different principles in their toolkit so that they know in which situation to pull which tool out and apply which tool in which situation. So the similarity here, again, is that with Gulick and Weber and Taylor is we are looking at a one-size-fits-all approach. These are the principles that apply to every organization, regardless of the context of the situation, according to Luther Gulick. The difference is that Gulick is looking at these principles as tools for managers, as opposed to Taylor looking at the work process, as opposed to Weber looking at the organization structure of the organization itself. So Gulick would lead us to believe, along with Fail and Mooney, that if we can identify the right principles, teach these principles, this is what will make our organizations effective. There were some prominent criticisms of the principal school. And those criticisms came from Herb Simon and Dwight Waldo. And these are two of the primary critics of the principal school. Simon's major critique of the principal school is he referred to it as not the principal school, but rather the school of proverbs. He says, just like with any proverb, you can find a countervailing proverb. So for any proverb, you're going to find a proverb that will tell you the exact opposite of what this proverb said. He said it's the same thing here with the principles approach. That if you select, go back to your principles, if you select, well, I'm going to engage in coordinating right now, then you're not going to be able to engage in planning. Well, if you say I'm going to do staffing right now, then you might not be able to engage in reporting. So the argument is that they can kind of be mutually exclusive, and one may be able to then cancel the other one out. Dwight Waldo referred to the principal school as prescriptions, that these are not principles, these were prescriptions. He said that the principal school was non-scientific. He said that these principles in the principal school are value-laden. And they are value-laden because they are designed to emphasize values such as top-down executive control and centralization in our organizations. If you go back and you look at these principles again, all of these principles are all centralizing principles in that these are principles that are being done at the top level of our organization. Planning is initiated at the top level of our organization. Organizing is at the top level. Staffing decisions are signed off on at the top level. Directing is obviously from the top level, and so on and so on. So he would make the argument they're not principles, but rather they're prescriptions for how you can control and how you can exploit employees. So the principal school was not without its detractors. And again, primarily those detractors are Herb Simon and Dwight Waldo. So just like we've done with Weber and Taylor, let's take the principal school, Fail, Mooney, and Gulick, and take a look at where they fit in terms of our models of organizational effectiveness, mechanisms for control, and motivational strategies. In terms of our models for organizational effectiveness, they are very much in alignment with Weber and Taylor in that they emphasize the rational goal model and the internal process model. Not a whole lot of talk about the external environment, not very much talk at all about human resources and helping people develop as human resources. It's very much organized around how can we make the organization effective and efficient, and how can we do that by focusing internal to our organization and embedding these principles internally within our organization. So I think when you look at all the classic theorists together, what ties them all together, they're all rational goal model, they're all internal process model for organizational effectiveness. In terms of our mechanisms for control and coordination, direct supervision. Because again, as Waldo tells us, this is very much oriented around a top-down type of centralizing approach. So therefore, very much about direct supervision. And that's how you control those internal processes, by directly supervising and controlling the work of employees. In terms of motivational strategies, pretty much all about legal compliance, holding people accountable to these principles and making sure that people are doing the job in the way in which they are commanded to do their jobs. There's very little of any of the human relations elements, very little of the instrumental rewards, really no job identification, and really no concern whatsoever about finding congruence between organizational and individual goals and values. So in terms of the classical school, those are the primary theorists that we cover in this class for the classical school. Chronologically, we are looking at starting with Max Weber in the late 1800s and running up into the 1930s and the 1940s. And that's kind of the chronology then of this classical school, all tied together by the search for the one-size-fits-all approach, that if we can find the one best structure, the one best way to organize work, the one best way to the best principles that can then be adhered to by our managers. If we can find that one size fits all approach, that's then what's going to make our organizations effective and efficient. The difference is obviously their discrete focus. Structure for Weber, work process for Taylor, these principles for Fayol, Mooney, and Gulick. So at this point, are there any questions? I know I've been talking for a while now. Any questions about the classical school? You know, again, we've kind of covered it in the same way we did in 500, just a lot more in depth here in 660. So any questions on any of this information? Then that gets us to the big so what question of, well, how does this then apply to our organizations? Does it apply? And if so, how does it apply to our organizations? So what I thought we would do then is we'll take a break, and then after our break, we'll come back and I'll put you in some breakout rooms. And I like to do this every class session. And each of our groups will then talk about your individual organizations and identify at least two aspects of classic organization theory that you see in your organization. So at least two of those elements of classic organization theory, and how beneficial or detrimental are these elements of classic organization theory for the effectiveness of your organization. So how do they contribute to, or how do they detract from the effectiveness of your organizations? As always, each one of our groups should select a spokesperson who will share the group's results. We'll go ahead and take a break. We'll take a break until we'll say 7:30, and then we come back at 7:30. I'll go ahead and create our groups. I'll put you into breakout rooms, give you about half an hour or so, just like last week, to work on this prompt. We'll then reconvene as a class, see what each one of our groups came up with. And at that point, we will assess our time. And if we have time remaining, then we may move into a little bit of pre-human relations theory. Otherwise, we might just hold that in abeyance and just do that next week with our neoclassical theories. But go ahead and take a break. We'll say take a break until 7:30. Come on back at 7:30, and I'll create our groups, and we'll do our breakout rooms for about half an hour. Okay? Have a good break, and I'll see you back here in about 10 minutes or so. Okay, it's 7:30, so let me go ahead and create our rooms. We have 20, so let's create 4 rooms like last time. I think that'll work well with 5 in each room. So, all right, the rooms are create it. So I'm going to open it up in just a second. But again, you have the prompt on the screen, and we're going to look at about maybe half an hour or so working groups. I'll give you a 5-minute warning, a 2-minute warning, and then when I close up the rooms, then it gives you a minute to then leave the room and then come back into the main room. Do select a spokesperson, just like before, so that the spokesperson will then share the results from the group. Like I said, we'll spend about half an hour doing this. We'll reconvene and see what you came up with. All righty. So I'm going to open the rooms, and then you are free to go to your room. Okay, I think all the rooms are closed. I think we're all back in the main room now. So let me grab that. Okay, so let's start with room number one, and whomever the spokesperson is for room number one.
Sure. So I'll go ahead and speak for group number one. How's everyone doing? So our group consisted of, there were 5 of us, and 3 of us worked in worked at cities, at local governments. And I work in a nonprofit. I guess 4 of them work for the city. So our discussions were mostly based around the fact that a lot of their structures are very bureaucratic. To Weber's examples of very hierarchical systems within their job places, and almost to a detriment to the fact that each person is kind of extremely specialized in roles that they are unable to kind of work out of. They have to wait for somebody else to come and do that sometimes. Where a lot of folks have worked there long enough to just kind of continue advancing, even if they weren't really like the best people suited for the job, but they've just been there 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years at the job and slowly moving up the ladder. So that was kind of things that we noticed, but also in that same vein, it's kind of a lot of really organized in the sense of everybody kind of knows what they're supposed to do. So everybody has that one kind of task or multiple tasks that they're assigned to. 3 of us work in human resources, so we just kind of found it funny that in our line of work, we kind of do a bit of everything, and we have to know how to do everything, but we definitely run administration programs over folks who are highly specialized in, or have to be in their roles. Yeah, that's kind of what we discussed.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Jeremy. Very well done. And yeah, that hierarchical system certainly does create some challenges, and it's also, you know, when you cannot work outside a job description, you can't work out of your classification. So sometimes you do have to wait for someone else to come in and do that job, because if you would do it, you'd be working outside your description, and then it opens up meet and confer and a whole bunch of CBA issues as well. And so it certainly does limit us when we have a balkanized organization based upon the hierarchical structure. And I think those are all very good points. So well done. Thank you, Jeremy. How about room number 2?
I think we were room number 2.
Yes.
So we also talked about the hierarchical organizational structure at our agencies, and just like the positives of that being a clear chain of command, and specifically within leadership. So knowing who to go to authorize certain tasks. And one of the downfalls that we talked about is, and that a lot of us see in our organizations, is when there's a vacancy, and how that's a domino effect, and gaps within the hierarchical leadership. So I think Heidi mentioned that if a manager is specifically responsible for approving certain like resources for families, then if they're out there, it's just at a standstill, because that's the only person that's authorized to approve those certain approvals or referrals. And then along with that, we also talked about Weber's division of labor. So I know it kind of goes hand in hand, and just the positives of having specialized roles and departments that are responsible for those tasks. Vu mentioned also how in his division, it's really based on licensure. And so if you're either licensed or not to do certain tasks within his water district. Something that we talked about is that it also causes delays. So for example, If we have a new hire where I work at, which is a kind of a branch of IT, and they don't know yet who is responsible for certain tasks, then something that may have taken a day to get taken care of is being bounced from different departments, trying to figure out who's responsible for that particular task. So the positive is that for the most part, it is an organization. It is very organized, but it does cause delays on tasks that could have probably been taken care of much quicker, and clients would be happier in that sense.
Great. Thank you, Claudia. Well done. And yeah, I think the whole idea of vacancies, that's important, because when you have those vacancies, and then there are opportunity costs that are associated with someone else trying to step in and take over those tasks that are left undone by the vacancy. And that we oftentimes don't think a lot about those opportunity costs, that if this person is doing the functions and the duties of someone who is not there, then that detracts from their ability to do their normal functions. And so that can certainly kind of have that cascading type of slippery slope effect. So great. Thank you, Claudia. And thank you, room number 2. Room number 3.
I believe we're room number 3. So our group identified 3 factors of classical organizational theory to discuss. The first one being the span of control and unity of command. And similar to what other groups were mentioning in the hierarchy as well, this design can help with efficiency by management being able to delegate authority and not having to supervise a large number of staff members. But we all talked about kind of personal our experiences with that and the limitations that come with that, and being able to communicate with higher management when you have supervisors who maybe are limited in their capabilities, and you want to be able to kind of resolve something in a timely manner, and that definitely causes delays. So having that limited access can be detrimental. And we also talked about those of us who worked in private sector before public sector having to get used to that. Personally, I had never experienced that until I started state work, and so that was something very, very different that we had to get used to. The second one was stability of personnel. Again, like other group members talked about, the turnover rate can be very, very challenging. Irma actually discussed how she's having that issue right now at her job, that there's several positions that are open and it's causing her workload to increase. She's having to train on additional duties and tasks in addition to her regular duties and responsibilities. And so that's really causing delays and also causing friction a little bit among the staff as well. So that can affect kind of staff morale in a way. And then the third one was the specialization of tasks and how this delegation can definitely help with efficiency with production, but it can also lead to confusion and also friction within a department. Personally, I work with procurement in my division. And obviously, we have to follow very specific protocols and regulations in our purchasing to keep our purchasing authority within our region. And staff members have access to those procedures, but they oftentimes don't take the time because they have other duties as well, but they don't necessarily take the time to look through those resources available to them. And so when deadlines are coming up, or if they are not able to get their equipment or whatever they need in time, then they kind of vilify the procurement staff, kind of demonize us in a way that it's our fault, when in fact they have access to it. So but if they don't know about those procedures, I think you mentioned it's not cross-functional, right? So they don't have of that knowledge of those specific procedures. So yeah, that's pretty much what we talked about in our group.
Great, thank you, Emily. Yeah, procurement is as you know, working in procurement, it's kind of a completely different world than a lot of the other things going on in an organization. And there are so many procedures and rules that you have to follow, and in terms of contract code, that when you do have vacancies in procurement, you're understaffed in procurement, it's difficult to just bring somebody into that position, because in order to know all those rules and all those processes, you kind of have to do it. And the longer you do it, the more you get acclimated to all those rules. You just bring somebody new in, and it's going to take them a long time to get through that learning curve. And so I think procurement's an excellent example. So, thank you. Well done, Emily.
Thank you.
And we'll do room number 4.
feel like the fun in having group 4 is that everyone before you says pretty much everything you were going to say. So I'll try to spin it in a way that doesn't sound like I'm regurgitating. But I agree with the groups before me in saying that with the classical organization theory, there is a established set of hierarchy that does result in a lot of efficiencies that come from everyone knowing their place and what is suited for whose approval. However, the downside to that is if your chain of command is very large, then it can create a backlog. And I think one of the groups before we mentioned that if in the case of any staff being out, then it does create a delay there. However, on the plus side, it does safeguard against lower level employees like interns making decisions on behalf of the agency and entity. So that's a good thing there. And then the other thing that I found interesting that our group shared is that like I used to think about it like it's a lack of communication that can stem from maybe the lower level staff being passed along to the upper management staff, playing a game of telephone, the more staff involved, the more the messaging is getting passed along, the less it gets watered down or it may not be as true as the lower level staff may report up. But something I found interesting was that one of our team members shared that it could go the other way where a upper management staff or person may choose to withhold information, give it to give a certain circumstance or an outcome based off lower level employees. So it kind of works in both ways. There's perks and downsides to it. And then the other part about it is by having these hard set of responsibilities, protocols, and procedures, it does safeguard against concerns for liability for the agency because everyone's following the same rules. However, it can make it very difficult to implement new improvements that challenge those protocols, and making innovation very, very difficult to include sometimes. So those are what we had discussed in our group.
Perfect. Thank you, Chris. And yeah, those are all very important points. And yeah, and the one you mentioned about the communication, one of the most vital aspects for effective organizations is dealing with those communication problems. And there are a lot of barriers to communication vertically and as well as horizontally. And sometimes you're right, when you get that hierarchical system with that scalar chain, you have so many people and so many levels involved in that vertical communication that it really does become kind of that system of telephone, and that the message how it started down here is not the message that ends up at the top or vice versa. And so that's obviously a major problem that's associated with having those tall hierarchical systems. And so yeah, we do have some positives to a lot of these classical theories, but there are also a lot of negatives associated as well. And one of the reasons why bureaucracies are oftentimes held in such low esteem by the public, you can trace directly back to things such as the tall hierarchies and the institutional rigidity that comes from these classic organizational structures. But be that as it may, those artifacts of Weber and Taylor and the principles theorists, those are still very much alive and well, even in what we are considered to be modern day organizations. So thanks to all for the groups, very well done. But these issues that we run into with classic organization theory, primarily the issue of dehumanizing employees, that's really what has given rise to a lot of these more neoclassical theories that we're going to transition into a discussion of. And some of those neoclassical theories that were developed as rejoinders and responses to classic organization theory, things such as human relations theory, human resource management theory, systems theory, and some of our more modern theories, they're primarily predicated upon this problem of dehumanizing employees and not recognizing the social environment that is implicit within most of our organizations. And so as we make this transition from the classical school into neoclassical schools like human relations and human resource management theory, we really kind of had this segue that took place at the tail end of the classical school, but kind of predated the beginning of human relations school. And that kind of came from Mary Parker Follett. And from our 500 class, I'm a big fan of Mary Parker Follett. And one of the things I like to do in this class is really to kind of delve more deeply into Follett's theories as kind of this segue to move us from the classical world into the neoclassical world. But I also recognize that it is Monday and you've probably had very long days. And so rather than getting into human relations theory with Mary Parker Follett tonight, I think we'll end it here. I mean, it's 8:16, so we'll end it here. I don't really want to get into neoclassical theory and then have to stop it. So next week, when we get together again next Monday, we will start with Mary Parker Follett and we'll start our discussion of the neoclassical theories and how and why they were developed as responses to classic organization theorists. We'll do Mary Parker Follett as kind of a pre-human relations theorist, and then we'll move into our more mainline human relations theorists such as Elton Mayo and Fritz Roethlisberger, and then we'll move into a discussion of human resource management theory and why human resource management theory was developed as a response to some of the flaws in human relations theory. And that's when we'll get into Douglas McGregor, Chris Ardress, and kind of get into some of this discussion of motivational theories and how we can use some of those human resource management theories to motivate our employees to try and enhance the effectiveness and productivity of our organizations. So next week, we'll start getting into the neoclassical theory. Again, Canvas essay number 2 looks at differences between public and private organizations. So I look forward to reading your posts on that. Any questions that emerge between now and next Monday, feel free to send me an email. Happy to answer any questions you may have. So we'll have class then on the 20th. Then the following Monday is the 27th. So that's Memorial Day. So we're going to take that week off and then be back at the week after that. Okay. Sound good? Any questions or anything before we call tonight? Yes, Emily, go ahead.
Just a quick question about the second discussion. One of the groups that we picked, does it have to be one of the organizations that we're doing our analysis on, or can they be different?
It can certainly be different. Yeah, you do not have to talk about the organization you're doing your analysis on if you don't want to. And the nice thing about it is that you won't really be incorporating a lot of this into your organization analysis paper. So you certainly have the freedom to select a different organization for this post.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sure. Great question. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Hope you all have a great week. And then I'll see you again next Monday for a discussion of neoclassical organization theory. Have a great week. Talk to you next Monday. Take care.
Have a great week, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Have a good one.